Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Bookshelf Odyssey. My name is Art. Today, I want to talk a bit about Victober in general and celebrating 10 years of this reading challenge. To represent Victober, I'm wearing my Book Nerd t-shirt, and let's just dive into some memories. In a previous video or two, you might see one coming out, I mentioned that I thought I had done Victober when it was in its third or fourth year. So then I got poking around in some of the depths and darker recesses of the internet and on Katie's channel, and lo and behold, I remembered watching her first video announcing Victober. I don't think I commented. Back then, I wasn't a very active commenter. I was just a viewer, and I had a different channel. It might have even been a channel I canceled now, to be honest. Anyway, long story short, I've been doing Victober since the first year. And so I thought today it would be fun to dig into my archives, my records of books I've read, and see what I read for those early years of Victober. I could do a real deep dive and see what the year's prompts were and how my reading compared, but I'm not going to do that because I want this video to be short, like 10 minutes. We'll see how I can do it. So I won't be doing any deep dives into the books I mentioned. I mostly want to just talk about my memories and some of the classics I've read for the first time during Victober. So I believe then the first year took place in 2016. As I look at my records, a lot of my memory was coming back. I feel like the last years have just kind of morphed into, a handful rather than 10. But anyway, so the first year I took it easy. I was still relatively new to Victorian literature. I read Dickens. I think by that point I had read a lot of his, but not all of it yet. And I'm not sure I read anything else really other than Dickens, with the exception of a few George Eliots, actually. I do remember that. So the first year I took it easy. I read Turn of the Screw by Henry James, a classic ghost story, gothic story. I recall not enjoying that as much and really struggling to know what exactly was happening. That one might be worth a reread now, as I have gotten better at reading Victorian literature. Then I also had reread Silas Marner by George Eliot. That's a Victorian classic I read for the first time in my late teens or early 20s, and I remember enjoying it very much. And I'm sure on my reread I enjoyed it. I'm not sure I've reread it since then, though, but I have plans this year to reread Silas Marner, probably after Victober. It might be in November or December. I'm not sure yet. And then I also read the Michael Slater biography of Dickens. Now, I will talk about that biography a little bit more in an upcoming video. I'll be talking about some of my Charles Dickens books I have on my nonfiction shelf. But I didn't realize it had been 10 years since I read that last. I really think it's time for me to do a reread of that biography. I've got others I could read, but I just love Michael Slater's writing so much. And he's a preeminent scholar of Dickens that he's worth reading several times, I think. And that's all I read for Victober the first year. I remember also how exciting it was to find a community that loved Dickens and to discover other writing like that. I was really overjoyed to be a part of that experience. So then the next year, 2017, I read The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and Other Stories by Robert Louis Stevenson. I honestly don't remember much from that collection. I do remember reading Jekyll and Hyde. That was my first time reading it, and knowing already knew what the story was about. Basically, it's such a part of pop culture. It's hard not to. And honestly, if you haven't read that and don't know what the story's about, I almost envy you and your reading experience. Robert Louis Stevenson and I haven't really vibed very well. Even Treasure Island, I know this might be sacrilegious, but I don't really care for that book so much. But I did like Jekyll and Hyde, and I remember enjoying the stories he wrote. And then I read the big book I read for that month was Our Mutual Friend. So that was the first, and I thought the only time I've read it, but apparently I reread it just a couple years later, which surprised me. And see, this is what I mean when I said it feels like some of the years over the last few years have kind of just morphed together. Anyway, I was excited to read it. It was Dickens' last full novel. I thought Our Mutual Friend was kind of a mid to lower Dickens for me. And in my reread now, I'll be interested to see if that moves up or not. Dickens, his books do have a tendency to raise or lower as I reread, depending. A lot of it depends on my mood and reading experience. And that's really all I read in 2017. So I kept things pretty easy. But then 2018 marks a year that I really began to challenge myself as a Victorian reader. So I read a book called Dickens on America and the Americans by Michael Slater. And that's this book here. This is one of the books on my Dickens nonfiction shelf. So I can go ahead and talk a little bit about it now. And what this book is about is Michael Slater looks at the time of Dickens's life when he went to the United States. It discovers some of his views on what he thought of America and Americans, as well as how he portrayed America in his writings. What's really great about this book is it contains portions of letters where he writes to Americans or talks to about America. It includes portions from his book, The American Notes, from Dickens's book, American Notes, as well as characters that he created, some selections from Martin Chuzzlewit, as well as more writings and speeches where he discusses America. So if that's a topic that interests you, this is a great book to get because you have it all in one handy reference volume, along with editing and comments and some portions of the chapters written by Michael Slater. It also contains a lot of artwork, and here's an example of that. Anyway, it might be worth picking up if that's a topic of interest. And then I also read for the first time Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. And yes, my years-long battle with this book began in 2018. I remember reading it thinking it was a love story. Kind of how the new Wuthering Heights trailer makes you think it's this really beautiful, tragic love story. And it just, I'm like, these people are horrible. Why would anybody want to read this? Why would anybody find this romantic? And then, fortunately, book 2 came along and taught me. I think Katie was one and others that you can't read it like a love story. You have to read it like a revenge story or something like that. So I tried rereading it again. I believe it was 2021. And that helped, but I remember still not liking it. And then that mysterious third time, maybe I dreamt it. I don't know. I remember thinking, no, these characters are awful. Why would anybody want to read this? It's terrible. I got to read it again. So I tried again. What keeps me coming back to it, I think, is Emily Bronte's just mastery of description and dark Gothic vibes. I mean, Wuthering Heights would be a great novel if it weren't for the characters, which makes no sense, I suppose. Anyway, I've got to be honest now. I believe it was on Literary Princess's YouTube channel. She did a reaction to the Wuthering Heights movie trailer that just came out. What I like about that review is that it wasn't just reaction for the sake of reaction. She actually gave very thoughtful and informed critique of what she was seeing on screen. And I'll be honest, she made me want to read the book again. Now, there is an old saying that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. And it's possible, I might have to say guilty as charged there, that this book has driven me insane, and I have to try to keep reading it. But what she said in that video about Wuthering Heights really helped inform my reading, and that it's okay to not like these characters. In fact, I think she says you're not even supposed to like these characters. And I don't know, something about the way she described the book is kind of making me want to go back to it again. I know you're probably saying, don't do it. It's a trap. You'll just end up hating it and yourself for having read it. It's possible. But I don't know, maybe I'm just determined to understand this book and what makes it in people's mind so good. I saw another video recently as well, where they basically said that's the point. That's the mark of something that is artistic or of high art, of good art. It causes a emotional response, and it's that emotional response that makes it, whether it's good or bad, which I thought was interesting, because boy howdy, does Wuthering Heights cause an emotional response in me. Mostly it's rage and hatred of characters, and at the end myself. It's like when you've just shame ate a whole carton of ice cream, and now and you're lactose intolerant, and now you're just in the corner feeling sorry for yourself. Yeah, that might be my experience with it. I said I was going to keep this video to 10 minutes. That's not happening. So thanks for sticking with me through this. And then that month as well, I read Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. Now that one was brilliant. I've reread it since then. I've loved it every time. The story reads like just a compelling, shocking thriller, especially as we get into more of Helen Graham's backstory, and really introduced me to the story trope of women in bad marriages in the Victorian times, where they had no or very little legal recourse. If their husband was a jerk, they were kind of at the mercy of their husband. And what options did they have? Really good story. 5 out of 5 stars, no notes. I love Anne Bronte's writing. And I think that was the first Anne Bronte I read. And then there's only 2. So I can't remember what order I read that in. But it was either first or second, obviously. Anyway, I read that. I read, for the first time, Carmilla by J. Sheridan LaFanu. Boy, I'll get his name right one of these days. And I still need to read more by him. I've only read a couple novels, but what a great novella that was. It's a vampire story written by Victorian, read during spooky season, might have shades of lesbianism in it. What's not to love, right? I really enjoyed that. And my impression of that book is it helped me realize that there is a whole realm of Victorian writers that I haven't even heard of. And their books are just as good and can stand alongside of the books we always talk about. And it's only because there's so much attention given to people like, Charles Dickens and Jane Austen, who's, not a Victorian, but, those are the names that really get all the highlights and the attention, because everybody knows about them. But hey, let's dig in and deep and find something somebody hasn't heard of, or the underrated writers, which I'll be doing a series on those during Victober, so stay tuned for that. So I read a book called Great Expectations, The Sons and Daughters of Charles Dickens by Robert Gottlieb. That was interesting because that looked at Dickens's children and their life. And it was interesting how Dickens sent his sons out into the world. One went to America, he sent one to Australia. There were a few who died. A few of his kids died at a young age. And his daughter stayed behind and all that. But that was an interesting part of Dickens's life that this book explores, as well as the life of his children, trying to live in the light of a man who was so well known, so famous, so, what's the word I'm looking for? Zesty. Did they thrive under the bright light that was Dickens, or did that cause them to wilt? Really interesting book. Highly recommend that if you really want to get into Dickens knowledge. And then I also started reading Dr. Thorne by Anthony Trollope. I began that in October, and then that spilled into November. That's part of the Palliser series. You know the one I'm talking about. And I think it's the third one in that series. And love Anthony Trollope. What more can I say about that? And then, if you'll bear with me, I do want to do 2 more years. 2019 was a banner Victober reading year. I read the Wimborne Book of Victorian Ghost Stories, Volume 1. It probably was just a collection of Victorian ghost stories, surprisingly. And really began to appreciate the Victorian short story with that, which will come into play later, as in 2020, when I began my Christmas podcast. On that one, Cozy Christmas Podcast, I read a lot of Victorian short stories. A lot of them tend to be spooky, gothic stories, or really cozy, emotional kind of thing. And then I read Joy to the World, A Victorian Christmas by Cynthia Hart, which I thought I owned, but I can't find it. So that's odd. Maybe I got it from the library, just don't remember. What's interesting about my reading here is I'm seeing the seeds planted in my reading that would later inspire me to do a Christmas podcast. I read The Lifted Veil by George Eliot, which I believe is a novella. I don't remember if I enjoyed that or not. Looks like I rated that just about 3 stars. So for me, that's kind of didn't hate it, didn't love it, just kind of a average read. I read American Notes by Charles Dickens, which is a collection of travel notes he wrote when he toured America in the 1842 or 43. I can't recall offhand. He would later go on and write A Christmas Carol. So it might have been 1843. I think somewhat inspired by what he saw in America, along with some of the things he saw around in his own country. Maybe more on that in another video down the road. And then I read a nonfiction book called A Christmas Carol and its Adaptations by Fred Guida. And that looks at all the different movie adaptations of A Christmas Carol. I got that for Christmas. There's so many out there. Now, just between you and me, I don't think we need any more Christmas Carol adaptations. We have enough for now. I've got 5 words for you. Tale of Two Cities. I mean, the book's already practically like a screenplay. Just Hollywood, what are you doing? You're leaving money on the table. Okay, I won't get on that soapbox. Moving on. I read Queen Victoria, 24 Days That Changed Her Life by Lucy Worsley. From what I've read of Lucy Worsley's work, anything she's written is worth reading. She balances humor with facts, with fascinating history, and combines it into a compelling narrative. So read a little biography there of Queen Victoria. Then I read Mamie Dickens' book, My Father as I Recall Him. I won't talk about that book now, but I will in an upcoming video. Stay tuned. But that was such a sweet book to read. Mamie was one of Dickens's daughters, and she just writes about her experiences. Then I read The Return of the Native by Thomas Hardy. I remember really enjoying that. I'd been reading some Hardy by that point and was going along with him real well until a couple years later I read Jude the Obscure, and I haven't read anything by him since. So make of that what you will, but I do hope to get back to Hardy again. And then to wrap it up, the greatest Victober read of all time is Varney the Vampire, possibly by Thomas Prescott Prest. There's debates that who actually wrote it. Anyway, Varney was a penny dreadful. I'm pretty sure I read it during September and October. It's so long. I recommend if you read it on Kindle. From what I've heard, the print book is really hard. It's gigantic, plus it's small print, and it has like 2 columns on each page. The Kindle is a much easier reading time with that. This has got to be one of the best Victober books I've read, and got me into loving Penny Dreadfuls. I had thought Dracula was the first and really only vampire novel, and I love Dracula. I've reread it many times, but reading Carmilla and Varney and others like it have really helped me read beyond, like I said, the common, the well-known books, and it's worth taking that trip in Victorian literature. Now that we are 30 minutes into my 10-minute video, we get to 2020, the last year I wanted to talk about, the year of the pandemic. Overall, that year in October, I read an unbelievable amount of books. I read 30 books in October in 2020 because it was the pandemic. I can't remember if we were still in quarantine or not, but I know we as a family were, because that's the month that we got hit with COVID. And so we had to, spend like 2 weeks in, and then we had to have a period of quarantine after we got better, just to make sure. It was the worst of times in our country's history that month, I know, but in my reading life, it was the best of times. See what I did there? Sorry. And what I read for Victober, I didn't read that much, which I thought was surprising. But it could point to kind of some hidden depression I was feeling, that I didn't want to read some of my favorite kinds of literature. Anyway, I only read 2 books for the first time. One was called The Law and the Lady by Wilki Collins. Really good book. I still have a lot of Wilki Collins to read. I've read his 2 more well-known ones, and so I've been enjoying reading some of his lesser-known ones. And then continuing on Penny Dreadfuls, I read Wagner the Werewolf, spelled W-E-H-R, wolf, so that was weird. I remember not enjoying that as much as I enjoyed Varney, and in fact, I don't even remember what it was about, and have not really had a desire to revisit it. I'm actually thinking I might reread Varney again next year. That might be a fun project. And then for rereads, I reread Carmilla, and then I reread Dombey and Son. Well, this turned out to be longer than I expected, but thanks for coming down memory lane, and I hope that you found this enjoyable. I sure did, talking about it. Thanks to Katie and to Kate, who are 2 of the original hosts. And can I just say, please continue to do this for as long as you're able. If the day should come when you feel like it's time to pass the torch to the next generation of Victorian readers, please hand it off to somebody who will love and cherish this reading challenge and these books as much as you do. I have been so grateful to be a part of this event. I have always felt welcome in this community and encouraged to read Victorian works. These works have really profoundly impacted not just my reading life, but my own life. I found friends through this group, and it's just been the best. So thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. And thank you for this wonderful reading event. All right, enough of the mushy stuff. Let's get to reading. Stay tuned, because coming up next in my Victober videos, I will be beginning a series of underrated Victorian writers and having some guests on to talk about what writers we should be reading and why. Stay tuned for that. And until next time, happy reading. Take care.